He was just a boy chasing the wind, until the mountain bit back. Alone, poisoned, and growing weaker by the minute, Jack called for help no one could hear. But someone did. Not a man, not a hero, a dog. A German shepherd with a scar above his eye, and a name tag that hadn't been touched in 3 years. Zephyr. No one believed in miracles, until they saw what came next. A bond broken by cruelty, a reunion forged in pain, and a trail that led to something far darker than anyone expected. This story isn't just about a rescue, it's about remembering, fighting back, and giving lost souls a way home. Before we begin, have you ever had a dog who never stopped waiting for you? Drop their name in the comments. Let's make this story about all of them. And if you believe every lost animal deserves to be found, click subscribe. What you're about to witness may just bring tears to your eyes and hope to your heart. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the towering canopy of the Redwood Mountains, its golden light fading into a pale amber haze that clung to the forest's edge like breath on a cold mirror. The air carried that unmistakable scent of pine needles and damp earth, still heavy from a morning drizzle, while distant birds cried out somewhere above the tree line. It was early October in Northern California. Too early for snow, too late for summer. And in the small mountain town of Marlow Creek, life moved slowly and without fuss. But for 13-year-old Jack Morgan, this day was anything but ordinary. Jack was thin and wiry, his legs scuffed from endless summers of running barefoot through fields, his hazel eyes full of the stubborn defiance that only a child burdened by memory could carry. His light brown hair curled slightly beneath the brim of a forest green cap, and his flannel shirt, 2 sizes too big, hung loosely over a faded backpack slung across one shoulder. He had been hiking alone since noon, tracing a forgotten trail etched along the side of the canyon, a route he'd read about in one of his late father's old survival books. He loved these woods, and though his mother would have never approved of him going this far alone, he needed this, needed the quiet, needed to feel the world around him hum without noise, without pity. That was when it happened. The sound was subtle, just the snap of a twig beneath his boot, but what followed was anything but. Jack let out a sharp yelp as something struck his right calf, a flash of brown and movement in the underbrush. He stumbled back, and the pain hit him like a burst of fire. His vision blurred for a moment. He looked down and saw the 2 puncture wounds already purpling, swelling with alarming speed. A rattlesnake. He didn't see it, but he knew. His heart pounded. His breath came quick and shallow, and just as he reached into his pocket for his phone, his fingers met silence. A dead screen. The battery had given out an hour ago, somewhere back at the waterfall. He collapsed against a moss-covered rock, legs trembling. The pressure in his chest grew heavier as the pain surged up toward his thigh. "Help!" he cried, his voice echoing off stone and bark. "Please, someone, anyone!" His voice cracked. The wind did not answer, but something else did. Miles away, where the pine trees gave way to wider plateaus, Thomas Riley walked the trail he'd known for 20 years. A tall man in his early 50s, Thomas had the weathered skin of someone who lived with the land and the guarded quiet of someone who'd seen too much of war. His dark gray beard framed a face lined by time, his eyes sharp and steel blue, always scanning, always measuring. Dressed in a worn canvas jacket and hiking boots covered in dry dust, he moved like a man with purpose, even if that purpose had become quieter these days. Beside him walked Zephyr. Zephyr was a 6-year-old German shepherd, large-boned with a thick coat of black and rust fur, and a faded scar above his left eye that cut through his brow like an old lightning strike. His gait was strong but careful, and his ears twitched constantly at the sounds of birds, shifting leaves, and wind patterns. He wore a harness made of thick green nylon, and attached to it was a brass tag shaped like a crescent moon, engraved with the single word, Zephyr. Thomas never changed the name. When he found the dog 3 years ago, chained and half-starved at the edge of a ravine, that tag was the only clue to the life he'd had before. The two of them made a peculiar pair. Thomas rarely spoke aloud unless necessary, but Zephyr needed no prompting. The dog seemed to know where to go, when to stop, and what not to trust. That afternoon, as they rounded a bend overlooking the northern ridge, Zephyr suddenly froze. One paw lifted mid-step. Ears perked. Eyes locked onto something invisible in the distance. Then, with a low bark, a sound Thomas hadn't heard in months, the dog broke into a sprint. "Zephyr!" Thomas called, but it was too late. The dog was already weaving through the brush, tail high, muscles tensing like springs. Thomas cursed under his breath and followed as fast as his knees would allow. Jack's cries had weakened. His skin had gone pale and clammy. The forest around him began to blur, spinning like shadows on water. He whispered one more time, "Please." Then, from the haze, came rustling. Heavy, intentional. A dark shape emerged between the redwoods. A dog. Jack blinked. Through his dimming vision, he saw the pointed ears, the large frame, the way the animal paused. Cautious, assessing. The shepherd stepped closer, sniffing the air, then approached with a quiet confidence that Jack vaguely remembered. It wasn't just a dog. It was that dog. "Zephyr?" he choked. The dog paused, ears shifting slightly. Then Zephyr stepped forward and pressed his head gently against Jack's chest. Moments later, Thomas arrived, panting, and dropped to his knees. He saw the swelling, the bite, the boy's condition. His training kicked in like muscle memory. With practiced hands, he pulled out the emergency kit from his bag and began to work. "Hang in there, kid," he murmured. "You're not alone." Above them, the wind stirred the redwood boughs like soft breathing. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, and the last light of day painted the ridge with shades of bronze and morning. But beneath the brush, two souls, one lost, one scarred, had found each other again. And something unspoken had begun. The antiseptic air of the emergency room clung to everything, every breath, every blanket, every sterile wall. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, painting the corners of the room with a dull white glow. Outside the windows, the late October sky above Marlow Creek had darkened into a curtain of navy and fog seeping through the tall redwoods like a quiet tide. The mountain wind stirred the trees, but here in the hospital all was still, except for the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Jack Morgan blinked awake. His head was heavy, his right leg throbbing beneath layers of gauze and pressure bandage. His thoughts came slowly as though wading through syrup. His eyes adjusted to the light, and then they landed on the dog lying silently at the foot of his bed, the black and rust fur, the scar above the left brow, the brass tag. Zephyr Jack croaked. The name left his lips like a reflex, a word pulled from years of longing. At once, the German shepherd stirred, lifted his head and stepped forward without hesitation, resting his muzzle gently against the side of Jack's arm. His breath was warm and slow, his amber eyes fixed with something that felt like memory. The man beside the bed, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by wind and war, watched in silence. His name was Thomas Riley, a former wilderness rescue operative, now living in quiet solitude in the mountain woods. His jacket, smelling faintly of pine and charcoal, was slung over one arm. The other hand rested loosely on his knee, fingers tapping absently against the chair. "You called him that before," Thomas said quietly. Jack nodded slowly, his fingers brushing against the tag that still hung around the dog's neck. "I named him when he was a puppy. Zephyr, because he used to chase the wind." His voice cracked. "He disappeared 3 years ago. We thought maybe someone took him." Thomas exhaled, his eyes narrowing just a little as he looked at the dog now curled against the boy like a guardian returning home. "I found him out by Dead Man's Drop," he said. "Chained to a cedar tree, half-starved, shaking. That tag was the only thing he had on him. No chip, no collar, just the name." He paused, then added, "I kept it." Jack's throat tightened. "You saved him?" "No," Thomas said slowly, looking at Zephyr. "I think he just kept waiting." A soft knock interrupted the quiet. A nurse stepped inside, short and round-faced with curly auburn hair, pulled back into a bun and a badge that read, "Carla," pinned to her lavender scrubs. She walked with practiced ease, clipboard in one hand, IV fluid bag in the other. "Well," she smiled, "you're awake. That's a good sign." Jack tried to smile back, but winced as his leg reminded him of what had happened. Carla moved to his side, adjusting the IV and checking vitals. "You've been through quite a bit, young man," she said. "But you're one of the lucky ones." Jack looked at her. "The snake, was it really venomous?" Carla nodded. "Northern Pacific rattlesnake. The bite matched perfectly, 2 clean punctures, immediate swelling, localized necrosis setting in around the tissue. If your friend hadn't gotten you here within the hour." She shook her head. "Well, we'd be having a very different conversation." Thomas remained silent, jaw tight. "Most folks who get bit up there don't make it in time." Carla continued, giving Zephyr a look of reluctant admiration. "But from what I hear, it was this guy who led the way." She scratched Zephyr gently behind one ear. "You've got yourself a hero." Jack looked down at the shepherd, who blinked slowly, unbothered by the attention. The swelling in Jack's leg had already begun to ease, but the memory of that searing pain and the desperate moment he thought he'd die alone still throbbed just beneath his skin. When Carla left the room, Thomas stood. "I'll give you some rest." "Wait," Jack said. "You've had him this whole time?" 3 years, Thomas replied. "He never really bonded with anyone but me. Never barked, never chased squirrels, never even wagged much." He looked down. "But the moment he heard you cry out, it was like something woke up in him." Jack swallowed. "He never forgot me." Later that night, with Jack sleeping again, Thomas stepped out into the hallway. A faint hum of hospital machines followed him as he walked toward the far end where the waiting chairs sat beneath an old oil painting of the Redwood coast. He sat down heavily, rubbing his hands together. Something was shifting, something that gnawed at his gut. A woman approached, tall in her early 40s, lean frame under a charcoal gray jacket bearing the seal of the California Department of Wildlife. Her hair, ash blonde and streaked with gray, was tied back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes were sharp and unwavering. She moved with the authority of someone used to asking questions and getting answers. "Thomas Riley," she asked, voice calm but firm. He nodded. "That's me." "I'm Agent Dana Clark," she said, offering a hand. "We met briefly during the poaching investigation near Crescent Valley." He shook her hand. "That was a mess." "And it might still be connected," Dana replied. "We're tracking a network smuggling and training animals, especially dogs, for illegal activities. I've heard whispers about a shepherd with a scar over his eye. Found 3 years ago. No ID. I've been trying to trace him." Thomas's posture stiffened. "You think Zephyr's involved?" "I think he might be a survivor," she said, "which means he could help us find the people who weren't." Inside the room, Zephyr lay beside Jack, eyes half closed. His breathing was steady, peaceful. But beneath the fur, where the skin had once torn and healed, the faint scar remained a quiet map to a past no one had yet fully uncovered. Morning in Marlow Creek broke quietly. Pale sunlight filtered through the drifting fog spilling over the red rooftops and pine-shaded streets of the small mountain town. The hospital parking lot still glistened with dew, and the scent of wet bark lingered in the air. In room 204, the window was cracked open just enough for the breeze to carry a whisper of the forest inside. Jack Morgan sat upright in bed, now his complexion no longer ghostly but still pale, his hazel eyes more focused than the day before. His right leg remained propped up on a pillow, but the pain had dulled to a steady throb. Across from him, seated stiffly in the visitor chair with his arms crossed, Thomas Riley watched the boy closely. Zephyr lay between them, resting his head on Jack's lap tail, gently thumping against the blanket at intervals as if keeping time with Jack's words. "He was only 4 months old when we got him," Jack said quietly. Golden brown eyes, floppy ears. He used to trip over his own paws. He paused, a fond smile curling. "I named him Zephyr the first day. Made him a tag from one of Mom's old brass buttons. Scratched his name in with a nail." Thomas didn't speak, but his jaw shifted slightly. He glanced at the tag hanging from Zephyr's collar now. A real one, polished and etched properly, but still bearing the same name, Zephyr. "We lived closer to town back then," Jack continued. "One morning he just vanished. No broken fence, no paw prints, nothing. My mom thought he ran off, but I always felt someone took him." Thomas's voice, low and gravel-edged, cut through the stillness. "You were right." Jack looked up. "I've seen animals chained in ways you can't imagine," Thomas said. "Baited, starved, turned into tools. Zephyr wasn't just lost. He was dumped like trash. And the way he reacted when you called his name, that doesn't come from nothing." Silence followed. Just then, the door opened gently, and Agent Dana Clark stepped inside. She was dressed the same as the night before, gray tactical jacket jeans and sturdy boots, but this time her hair was braided back and a tablet rested in her hands. She gave Jack a small nod. "You're looking better," she said. Jack straightened. "Thank you for helping me." Dana's expression softened. "Actually, you and your dog may be the ones helping us." She pulled over a second chair and sat across from both of them. "I need to tell you something. We've been tracking a network, small but organized. They steal dogs, mostly untagged or unchipped, and train them for illegal tasks. Fight rings, courier jobs, sometimes worse. We've found scars, evidence of abuse, even signs of chemical exposure in some." Jack instinctively placed a hand on Zephyr's neck. The dog shifted closer. 3 years ago, Dana continued, there was a missing shipment of 4 dogs from a transport site about 40 miles north of here. It was covered up quietly. But one of the descriptions matches your dog, a male German Shepherd pup, approximately 16 weeks with unusually light eyes. Thomas leaned forward. "And the people responsible. We have names but no proof. Yet." Jack looked at Zephyr, tracing the edge of the old scar above the dog's left eye. "So what now?" Dana turned to Thomas. "You said he sometimes gets restless during your hikes." Thomas nodded. "Certain places make him freeze. Other times he drags me toward something I can't see. It never made sense." Dana stood and looked out the window. "Dogs remember more than we give them credit for. Smells, sounds, even trauma. If Zephyr could guide us to one of those places, just one, we might find something." Jack sat upright. "Let's try." "You just got out of a hospital bed," Thomas reminded, his voice gruff. "I'm not saying today," Jack countered, "but soon. If he remembers something, I have to know what it is." Dana nodded approvingly. "We'll keep it local. No danger. You just let Zephyr lead." That afternoon, with hospital clearance, Jack was wheeled out to the garden by Carla the nurse from the day before. She pushed his wheelchair slowly, careful not to bump the wheels on the uneven bricks. Carla, mid-30s, cheerful but sharp, had once worked in ER trauma in Sacramento before moving up to Marlow Creek after a particularly harsh winter and a broken engagement. Her way of speaking was quick, but her hands were always gentle. "You've got that look in your eyes," she said, as Zephyr walked faithfully beside them, like someone who lost something and found it again. Jack smiled faintly. "Maybe I did." Carla leaned against the garden bench and took out a granola bar from her pocket. "You know, I had a dog once, when I was little. Name was Toby. He got hit by a truck when I was 9. Her voice tightened just slightly. "Funny how they never really leave." Jack nodded. "I don't think Zephyr ever left me either. Just got stuck somewhere, waiting." Back inside, Thomas was reviewing a local topographic map with Dinah. She had pulled up an overlay of missing dog reports, known illegal sites, and backwood trails not listed on public maps. "If we follow the eastern ridge," Dana said, pointing to an intersection near Broken Rock Trail, "there's an old ranger station abandoned 10 years ago. You said Zephyr once refused to go near that side?" Thomas nodded. He growled for 10 straight minutes. Dana marked the location. "Then that's where we start." That night, Thomas stood outside Jack's room, watching the boy sleep with Zephyr curled beside him like a shadow that finally found its light. Something in him softened, but also tightened. Guilt, maybe. Or something older, like fear of being a placeholder in someone else's story. And in Zephyr's slow, steady breath, there was more than rest. There was memory. And memory was beginning to wake. The forest east of Marlow Creek was different, older, quieter, the kind of place where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Pines grew in thick clusters, their trunks gnarled and roots like veins sprawled across the mossy earth. It had rained the night before, and the scent of damp bark mixed with the sharp tang of decay. The trail they followed was barely visible now, just a suggestion of footfalls long abandoned. Fallen branches and blackberry brambles clawed at their boots as they made their way deeper into the trees. Thomas led the group with practiced silence, one hand gripping the strap of his field pack. His jacket, dark canvas now stained with mud, moved stiffly against the wind. Jack followed a step behind, walking carefully with the aid of a carbon trekking pole Dana had brought. His right leg still ached where the snakebite had left its mark, but determination burned in his hazel eyes. He wore a navy hoodie under a worn brown parka, the sleeves too long a remnant from last year's winter. Zephyr walked several paces ahead, his nose low to the ground, muscles taut. His gait was no longer casual. It was purposeful, focused, as if the trees themselves whispered directions only he could hear. Agent Dana Clark brought up the rear, scanning the perimeter as they moved. Her expression was unreadable beneath the brim of her tactical cap, and the dark holster on her hip swayed with each step. She carried a small black case tucked under one arm inside it, a field tablet and a drive she hadn't yet opened in front of the others. Her instincts buzzed. She'd seen animals behave like this before, victims returning to scenes of their own undoing. After nearly an hour, Zephyr stopped. The group came to a halt in a small grove where the trees suddenly parted into a clearing no wider than a 2-car garage. At the center stood a rotting tree stump, its top flat and splintered, surrounded by rust-colored soil. Near it lay an overturned metal bucket dented and streaked with old grime. Beside that, nearly covered by damp leaves, was a length of rusted chain. Jack stepped forward carefully, eyes fixed on the chain. "This is it," he whispered. Thomas crouched and pushed back the leaves with a gloved hand. The chain had been looped around a half-buried iron post, the kind often used for anchoring heavy outdoor equipment. Except this wasn't industrial. It was welded into the root of the tree stump, a place never meant to be found. Dana knelt beside him. Her face didn't change, but her voice dropped. This wasn't for training. This was containment. She reached into her bag and pulled out a plastic bag. With tweezers, she picked up a small strip of rotted fabric snagged under the chain. Faint traces of fur still clung to it. Zephyr stood rigid tail, low ears pulled slightly back. He didn't growl, he didn't need to. The pain in his posture said enough. Behind the stump, Jack noticed something half buried in the soil. He knelt and brushed it off slowly. A cracked plastic food bowl green with mildew. The word champ was faintly stenciled in red along the edge. He held it up, grimacing. They didn't even call him by his name. Dana nodded toward another corner of the grove. Thomas, there's something near that trunk. Thomas walked over and peeled back a tangle of vines. Hidden beneath was a shallow wooden box half collapsed and riddled with chew marks. Inside, brittle straw and a tiny rubber toy in the shape of a bone. Faded, but still intact. The box had once been a kennel makeshift cruel and meant to keep a young dog barely alive. That's puppy size, Dana muttered. They had him here when he was still growing. Zephyr slowly approached the box, sniffed once, then turned and sat down beside it. Not alert, not fearful, just still, watching, remembering. Jack stood silent for a long moment before kneeling beside the dog, wrapping his arms around Zephyr's thick neck. You didn't forget, did you? Thomas's hand tightened into a fist. He stepped back and looked around. We need to document this, for real. Dana tapped the side of her tablet. Already done. She turned the screen toward them. A grainy video played on loop. Shot in night vision, the frame shook slightly as something moved behind a stand of trees. Then a small, terrified whimper. A flashlight beam jerked into view. Two figures' faces covered dragged a struggling German shepherd pup by a wire lead. The dog was small ears too big for its head, and it let out a squeal as it was yanked forward. Jack's breath caught. That's him. Zephyr watched the screen eye's unmoving tail rigid. Then he turned away. The footage was from a game cam I got tipped off about last week, Dana explained. I didn't know what I was looking at until today. Jack looked at her. Where was this taken? Here, she said. This exact spot. The wind picked up slightly through the clearing, rustling the leaves and the broken tether like a shiver running through the trees. Thomas looked up, his face set. We bring this in. All of it. The chain, the video, the site coordinates. We push it up the chain and make someone care. Dana nodded. We will. Zephyr stood then calmly and walked back to the trail. He didn't bark, didn't look back. But he led confident now, no longer afraid of what this place held. Behind him, the others followed. What had once been a prison was now a piece of evidence. And in the trees above the forest watched silent witness to the cruelty of men and to the loyalty of something far more enduring. The rain came in thin veils that morning, pattering softly against the windows of Thomas Riley's cabin. Tucked high above the tree line on the western ridge of Marlow Creek, the cabin was a modest structure of cedar beams and stone chimney sturdy, but worn, surrounded by pine and silence. Inside the wood stove crackled gently, casting an amber glow over the room and warming the wet chill that clung to their clothes. The smell of damp earth and brewing coffee hung thick in the air. Zephyr lay curled by the firehead, resting on his front paws. Jack sat cross-legged on a patchwork rug nearby, his injured leg stretched out straight, wrapped in a clean bandage and resting on a stack of folded towels. His hoodie was still damp from the hike the day before, but he didn't seem to notice. He was staring at the brass collar Thomas had placed on the table, his old collar. The leather was cracked, the buckle stiff, but it still held the faded brass tag marked Zephyr. Above it, almost invisible, unless you looked closely, was a thin, jagged line across the leather stitched with coarse thread. Someone cut it, Jack said, voice low, and sewed it back. like they tried to hide it. Thomas sat across from him at the kitchen table, fingers interlocked, gaze fixed on the collar. That's what I thought, too. I kept it all this time because, I don't know. Something told me it mattered. Dana Clark stood near the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in parallel streaks. Her gray tactical jacket was draped over a chair, revealing a plain navy sweater beneath. Her badge was clipped to her waistband, and in her hands she held a portable hard drive no larger than a deck of cards. I managed to retrieve some of the metadata from Zephyr's subdermal chip, she said, finally turning back to them. It wasn't easy. The registry it was originally linked to was shut down 2 years ago. Someone tried to wipe the data. Jack looked up sharply. Why would they do that? Dana pulled out a slim tablet from her bag and tapped it awake. Because the chip didn't just contain ID, it had GPS logs, timestamps, location trails, and a transfer record. She handed the tablet to Thomas. On the screen was a map dotted with red markers stretching across the California border and dipping slightly into Oregon. Near the top of the screen was a blinking icon labeled Facility 07A, Redwood Transfer Site. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Redwood Transfer Site. It was a temporary holding station used by a training and rehabilitation program, registered under a shell company called Caniform Systems. Officially, it was shut down 4 years ago after a noise complaint. Unofficially. Dana zoomed in, revealing satellite images of fencing kennels and a set of unmarked trailers. It kept moving underground. The chip shows Zephyr was logged there for at least 3 weeks. Jack clenched his fists. So that's where they took him. Probably one of several places, Dana said. I cross-referenced the time period. Over a dozen dogs went missing in nearby counties during the same month Zephyr disappeared. 5 were never found. 3 turned up in different states. 2 were found dead. Jack blinked rapidly. Lips pressed tight. Thomas's voice dropped. And the people behind it. Dana pulled up another document. Names are buried. But this, she tapped a redacted contract showing payments and dates, shows someone was funding cross-border transfers. Someone with access to multiple properties. She flipped to another screen. A list of partial ID numbers and breed types. Some matched Zephyr's profile GSD, male, scar on brow, 4 months. Jack pointed. That's him. Dana nodded grimly. Yes. And this, she tapped another entry farther down, could be Bolt. The dog from the broken crate you found in Shackled Grove. Thomas leaned back, arms folded. So we've got movement patterns, aliases, a matching collar, and a list of victims. And a lead, Dana said. There's one location flagged in Oregon, just across the state line. It was listed as inactive, but Zephyr's chip pinged within 200 yards of it 12 days after he vanished. Thomas exhaled through his nose. And you want to go there? Dana nodded. Not just want. Need. Jack leaned forward. I want to come. Thomas immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. I'm not saying now Jack insisted. But this started with Zephyr. If anyone can find the next place, it's him. Dana gave Jack a level look. Let's take it one step at a time. First, we verify the Oregon site. Then we decide what comes next. As they spoke, Zephyr stood and walked over to the table, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood. He placed his muzzle gently on Jack's knee. His eyes deep amber and still reflected something unspoken. A knowing, a remembering. As if he too had seen the map and recognized where it pointed. Later that afternoon, Dana stepped outside to make a call. The rain had slowed, but the clouds still pressed low. She stood beneath the overhang phone to her ear, waiting. A voice answered on the other end. Female firm, no nonsense. Lieutenant Grace Hollis, this is Agent Clark. I need access to Site 07B, Oregon Border Pine Hollow Sector. A pause. Then I thought that place was sealed. So did I. Another pause. Then, you think it's still active? I think it holds answers, Dana said, and a history someone tried to erase. Inside, Jack sat beside Zephyr, tracing the stitched cut on the old collar with his fingertip. They tried to erase you, he murmured, but they didn't win. You came back. And across from him, Thomas finally unfolded the collar and placed it gently on the table, no longer just a relic, but a piece of a story that was finally being heard. The clouds rolled over Grayfield Ranch like a curse, low and heavy, smeared in ash gray across the sky. Wind howled through the broken slats of the outer fencing, bending the trees along the Oregon border. Rain had already begun to fall, first as a light drizzle, then as a sudden lashing downpour. The air smelled of wet earth, rusted metal, and something fouler beneath the stink of confinement. Jack tightened his raincoat around his shoulders, his breath fogging as he stepped through the mud. He limped, leaning harder on the walking stick Dana had given him, but he kept pace. The rain soaked through his jeans, plastered his hair to his forehead. His eyes stayed on Zephyr, who moved silently ahead, ears back, tail low, every step deliberate. Behind them, Thomas Riley moved like a man back in a war zone. His flannel shirt was dark with rain, his boots sunken in the muck. One hand clutched a flashlight, the other gripped a crowbar. His jaw was clenched so tight it made his neck ache. He had hoped never to be in a place like this again. Dana Clark brought up the rear, calm under pressure. Her ponytail was damp, and her field jacket bore the insignia of the California Wildlife Crimes Task Force. She held a radio in one hand and a sidearm in the other. Her voice was sharp and steady as she whispered into the mic Team Alpha confirm entry, northeast perimeter clear. The voice crackled back. Confirmed. We're in position. The Grayfield site had once been a horse boarding ranch, but the barn now stood hollow and warped windows, boarded roof patched with tin and tarp. It had become a ghost farm, perfect for illegal use. According to the partial data from Zephyr's chip and Lieutenant Grace Hollis's satellite sweep, this was one of the last known stop points for trafficked dogs. Tonight it would be exposed. Zephyr led them toward a sagging side gate behind the main barn. He stopped suddenly, his hackles rising. His body dropped low, tail stiff, nose lifted. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Jack reached to steady himself against the gate. He remembers, he whispered. Thomas nodded. He knows this place. Dana moved first, kicking open the rotting gate with one boot. The hinges screamed. Inside, the yard was littered with rusted cages, overturned crates, and collapsed pens. No lights, no voices, just rain and wind and the distant hum of power lines. Then a bark sharp and panicked from inside the barn. Zephyr bolted. Zephyr, Jack cried, stumbling after him. Thomas caught him by the arm. Stay close, Thomas barked. The three rushed through the yard as Zephyr flung himself at a side door, paws scratching furiously. Thomas smashed the lock with the crowbar. The door burst open. Inside was darkness, thick and sour with the smell of urine and rot. Zephyr raced into the shadows, barking now not with fear but urgency. Dana flicked on her flashlight. Far corner. They found them. 7 cages, haphazardly stacked and zip-tied shut. Inside, dogs whimpered tails, tucked eyes wide with exhaustion. German shepherds, huskies, 2 pit mixes, all matted, some bleeding. One was just skin and bones, its body curled so tight it looked folded. Thomas and Jack began cutting the ties, pulling open cage doors. Dogs crawled out, flinching at touch. One, a brown and black shepherd with a deep scar across his muzzle, staggered forward and locked eyes with Zephyr. The two stood still for a second, then lunged into each other. Zephyr whined, pawing the other dog's neck. The other licked his muzzle and let out a soft whimper. "That's him," Jack said hoarsely. "That's Bolt." Thomas stared. His eyes glistened in the flashlight's beam. Dana was already on her radio. "We've got 7 live. Repeat 7. Condition poor. Begin evac now." One of the shepherds tried to run past Jack, but slipped and fell. Jack dropped to his knees in the mud, cradling the trembling animal. "Easy, buddy. We've got you." "You're okay." Zephyr barked toward the rear of the barn. Dana and Thomas followed. Behind a stack of crates was another hidden room, smaller, darker. Dana used the butt of her gun to crack the lock. The door groaned open. Inside was a makeshift surgical area. Blood-stained cloths, vials of tranquilizer metal restraints. A clipboard hung on the wall with names and numbers, many scratched out. Dana's face tightened. "This wasn't just transport," she said. "They were testing something here." Thomas's voice was hard. "How long do you think this has been going on?" "Too long." They heard tires skidding outside backup had arrived. Lieutenant Grace Hollis, tall and solid with short salt and pepper hair and a military bearing, entered with 2 officers in tow. She wore tactical gear with a body camera strapped to her chest. Her expression was unreadable as she took in the scene. "You were right," she told Dana. "This is bigger than we thought." By dawn, the barn was swarming with responders, animal control medics, state troopers. The rescued dogs were loaded into heated vans wrapped in towels. Bolt stayed close to Zephyr, tail wagging despite his exhaustion. Jack stood watching from a distance, arms crossed tight against the cold. His eyes never left Zephyr and Bolt. He remembered his friend, he murmured. Even after all that, Thomas stood beside him. They always do. That's what makes them better than us. Later, as the storm began to clear, Dana handed Jack a photo. It was a still frame from the barn's interior camera, now submitted as evidence. Zephyr and Bolt side by side, eyes glowing in the dark, united again. Jack stared at it for a long time. "They survived," he said. Dana nodded. "Because of you. And him." Jack didn't answer. But when Zephyr came and pressed his head gently into Jack's side, the boy wrapped both arms around his neck and didn't let go. The town square of Marlow Creek hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. Strings of soft amber lights hung from cedar poles, swaying gently in the late autumn breeze. Folding chairs lined the brick plaza where local families, volunteers, and officials gathered with cups of cider and scarves around their necks. Children ran between the booths, handing out flyers while an acoustic band played slow, earthy music beneath a tent decorated in red and gold. But the crowd's attention was centered on a small stage beneath the courthouse steps where one boy and one dog stood side by side. Jack Morgan's hair was combed neatly for once, though the wind made a mess of it again. He wore a navy wool coat that fit just right this year, and in his hands he held a wooden plaque etched with his name and Zephyr's. His leg still bore the echo of injury, but he stood tall without his walking stick now. Beside him, Zephyr sat calmly, tongue peeking slightly between his teeth, wearing a blue and silver service vest marked with the words, Honorary K9, Marlow Creek. The scar above his left eye was still visible in the afternoon light, but there was no more fear in his posture. Only pride. Mayor Rachel Denning, a tall woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a French twist, stepped up to the microphone. She had once been a lawyer in Portland, but returned to her hometown after losing her sister in a wildfire. Since then, she had governed with both toughness and heart. Her wool blazer was adorned with a red poppy pin, and her voice carried with quiet authority. This town, she said, has seen storms, fires, losses. But today we gather for something rare, a story that brought us together. A boy, a dog, and a name that never faded. She turned toward Jack. You didn't just survive, Jack. You saved others. And Zephyr. Well, Zephyr remembered. Applause rose around them. Jack glanced down at his companion, who leaned gently into his leg. Zephyr's tail thumped once, twice. In the front row, Thomas Riley stood beside a row of animal rescue volunteers. He looked older in the daylight, his sun-worn face, freshly shaved hair combed but still unruly. He wore a clean flannel tucked into jeans and held a notebook in one hand, the first draft of his memoir. The title was penciled across the top page, The Dog Who Carried Wind. Next to him, Dana Clark clutched a black folder marked with the seal of the California Wildlife Crimes Task Force. She wore a forest green blazer for the occasion and sported her usual ponytail, though a streak of silver now wove through it. Her face was unreadable as always, but her eyes lingered on Zephyr with something softer than professional pride. When the speeches ended, the mayor invited Jack to speak. He stepped forward slowly, heart pounding. The mic was taller than he was used to, but he didn't lower it. He let his voice rise as it was. "I thought I lost him," he began. 3 years ago, Zephyr vanished. I thought maybe he'd been hit by a car or wandered too far, but he didn't run away. He was taken." The crowd quieted. They tried to erase him, his name, his past, everything. But he held on. He held on to me. Jack reached down and rested a hand on Zephyr's back. He remembered who he was, who I was, and he came back. He paused. "That's why names matter. That's why we can't stop fighting for the ones who don't have a voice." From somewhere near the back, someone called out amen to that. When the applause came, it was louder than before. Not polite, resounding. Afterward, as the crowd began to mingle, Jack stepped down from the platform. Thomas approached quietly. "You did good," he said. Jack nodded. "You sure?" Thomas glanced at Zephyr. He knew his name before I ever did. I just helped him stay alive long enough to remember it. They stood in silence a moment. Then Jack said softly, "Will you be okay?" Thomas looked down at the notebook in his hand. "I think so. I've got stories to tell, and maybe a little more left to give." Across the plaza, Donna stood at a booth newly unveiled that morning. A large canvas banner read, "Project Zephyr, a campaign for the forgotten animals." Beneath it were photos of rescued dogs before and after, lined neatly with captions and QR codes for donations. A young volunteer no older than 17 passed out buttons with Zephyr's profile printed on them. Dana turned as Jack approached. "I didn't think you'd name it after him," he said. "He's the reason we cracked it open," Dana replied. "The reason you stood up. The reason we found Bolt. It's only right." Bolt, now healthier and calmer, lay beneath the table chewing a soft rope toy. His tail wagged slightly when he saw Zephyr. The two touched noses gently. Dana nodded toward the board. Every name up there was once just a number. Now they've got names again. Stories. Jack watched the photos. Some of the dogs still looked haunted, but others were smiling, playing, reuniting with families. A German shepherd with a pink bandana, a mixed breed with 3 legs, a golden retriever curled beside a little girl in a wheelchair. Dana handed Jack a pin. "You earned this too." He took it, smiling. The sun began to lower behind the ridge, painting the town in warm bronze. Music drifted through the air again, this time slower, gentler. Zephyr leaned into Jack's side, and Jack wrapped an arm around him. Thomas stood near the edge of the plaza watching. He didn't wave, didn't call out. But there was something in his face, equal parts ache and peace. And then slowly, he turned and began walking down the path that led toward the hills. He would write. He would heal. And maybe someday he'd raise another pup. But for now, the wind had settled in the right place, and Zephyr had come home. A year had passed, and the pines still stood tall. Outside the Redwood Center for Animal Recovery, the late spring sun filtered through green needles, casting dappled shadows over a group of children seated in a semicircle on woven mats. Birds flitted between branches. A wind, warm and sweet with the scent of moss and pine bark, moved gently through the clearing, tugging at the edge of banners hung across the fence. One of them read, "Loyalty Lives Here," with Zephyr. The center had once been a rundown ranger station, but under new funding and community care, it had become a small sanctuary offering animal-assisted therapy for trauma survivors, veterans, and children. Its most beloved member was a German shepherd with a faded scar above his left brow and a calm, steady gaze that made children feel safe. Zephyr. Now 7, his once vigilant body had grown a little softer at the edges, his fur tinged with silver around the muzzle. But his eyes were still sharp, and his presence still commanded quiet awe. Today he sat on a blanket beside his boy, Jack Morgan, who now wore a pressed button-down khaki slacks and a small clip-on microphone. Jack had grown, too. 14 now, a little taller voice, a touch lower, but still marked by the gentleness that came from surviving things most kids never imagined. He held a laminated card in his hand, glanced at it once, then faced the small camera crew from PBS Kids. The producer, a red-headed woman in her 30s named Leah Kimball, crouched nearby. She wore a utility vest covered in pens, sticky notes, and a laminated staff pass. Her personality was energetic but kind, and she had a gift for making nervous kids relax. Her curly hair bounced every time she encouraged Jack. "Okay, sweetie," she said. "We're rolling. Just be yourself." Jack nodded. He turned toward the group of kids and the camera beyond and began. "Hi, I'm Jack. This is Zephyr. And today we want to talk about loyalty." He looked down, smiled as Zephyr nudged his hand. "When I was 10, Zephyr disappeared. I thought I'd lost him forever. But 3 years later, he found his way back to me after everything. After pain, after being hurt. He still knew who I was. He never forgot my voice. One of the kids, a boy in a wheelchair named Nico with olive skin and soft curls, raised his hand. Did he really remember you? Like, for real?" Jack nodded. "Yeah." The second he heard me say his name, he came straight to me. That's how loyalty works. You don't have to see someone every day to love them. Nico smiled and scratched the ears of the Labrador lying across his feet. Behind the camera, Dana Clark stood quietly, arms crossed, watching with an unreadable expression. She no longer wore a badge she had stepped down after the trial that followed Grayfield, but had taken on a full-time role at the center designing programs for rescue animals and working closely with at-risk teens. Her hair was shorter now, chin-length and graying in patches. She looked less like an agent, more like someone who'd finally made peace with the work she'd done. Nearby, in the shade of a pine, an old man sat in a wooden folding chair, quiet as the wind. Thomas Riley. His hair had gone nearly silver, trimmed shorter than before. A clean navy jacket hung over his frame, and a leather-bound journal rested in his lap, its corners worn pages marked with hundreds of dog-eared memories. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. When the segment wrapped, Jack rose and patted Zephyr's side. The dog rose with him, tail swaying like a slow metronome. Leah clapped softly. "That was beautiful, kid. You're a natural." Jack smiled, but said nothing. He stepped off set and made his way toward Thomas. Zephyr trotted beside him, stopping once to sniff a daisy blooming in the grass. Thomas looked up. "You speak better than I ever did at your age." Jack shrugged. "He makes it easy." Thomas smiled faintly and then opened the journal. "I added a chapter this morning." Jack sat beside him on the bench. "What about the sound he makes when he sleeps?" Thomas said. "How it changed after he came home. How it got softer. Like he knew he didn't have to stay ready anymore." Zephyr lay at their feet now, resting his head on his paws, content. Jack looked at the trees around them. It still feels like he hears things I don't. The wind, the woods. Thomas followed his gaze. He's part of this place now. Dana approached with 2 mugs of lemonade, handing one to each of them. PBS wants to run the full episode as part of a summer series, she said. They're calling it Kindred Tales. Jack smirked. Zephyr's gonna be famous. He already is, Dana said. You both are. Across the field, children played with therapy dogs in the grass. Bolt, now fully recovered, chased butterflies with a shepherd-collie mix named Clover. The center buzzed with life. Music played faintly from the speakers, a gentle acoustic guitar. As the sun dipped lower behind the ridge, the pines whispered again, soft, bending gently in a breeze that had arrived without warning. Zephyr lifted his head slightly, ears, twitching eyes half-lidded. He didn't bark, didn't move, just listened. And then he laid back down, sighing through his nose. Jack leaned back and watched the branches sway. Sometimes I think the wind is him, he said softly. Like, not him, but something he carries with him. Thomas didn't answer right away. He took a sip of lemonade, then said, or maybe he just reminds the world to keep moving. Dana turned toward the field where the light had grown golden. And not forget. The sky turned to fire behind the trees. The wind passed again, light, wordless, almost reverent. Zephyr opened his eyes, blinked once, then laid his head on Jack's shoe. Some stories never end. They simply become part of the landscape. Sometimes the most powerful miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. They come on 4 legs with a quiet bark and a name they never forget. Zephyr's story reminds us that no pain is too deep to heal, no soul too lost to find its way home, and no love too far gone to be rekindled. Through darkness, through cruelty, and through years of silence, what brought Zephyr back wasn't chance. It was something greater. Perhaps it was God whispering through the pines. In our everyday lives, we often overlook the quiet blessings, the loyal pet waiting at the door, the hand that reaches out when we're in need, the breeze that makes us pause and feel. But maybe that's where miracles hide. Not in spectacle, but in faithfulness. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Drop a comment below and tell us. Have you ever experienced a moment that felt like more than coincidence? And if you believe that every soul, animal, or human deserves to be remembered, loved, and redeemed, type Amen in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and the bond that defies time. May God bless you, and may He watch over the ones who never stopped waiting.